Welcome, y'all. We're going to be reading Genesis together. Genesis is the foundational book, and we need to understand it if we're going to understand really anything about our faith in God. Paul makes plenty of reference to our faith being the same faith as Abraham. And where do you find about the life of Abraham? It's in the book of Genesis. Genesis sets the foundation, sets the framework for everything else. It sets the foundation for where Judaism is going to come from. When Moses comes along, of course, he writes Genesis. It sets the foundation for eventually our faith in Christ. You see the first inklings of the fact that we're going to get saved shows up in Genesis. If you really truly want to understand the Christian faith, shoot, if you want to understand the Jewish faith, you need to understand the book of Genesis. So we're going to be reading that. Now, I'm going to be trying to tread very, very lightly on the historicity of the creation through the flood. That would be Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. There are numerous ideas, particularly in modern times within the last couple hundred years, there are numerous ideas for what in Genesis, particularly 1 through 11, should be seen as actual or factual history of the world. Some of the more famous persons who have been speaking recently on this topic include Dr. William Lane Craig, namely in his book In Quest of the Historical Adam, where he cites Genesis 1 through 11 as mythohistory. Michael Jones, known as Inspiring Philosophy or IP on YouTube. Dr. John Lennox, who wrote the book 7 Days That Divide the World. And boy, is he right in that title. Who discusses the potential of an actual gap between each one of the days of creation and pointing to the language itself and to science as a backup for that. Dr. Gavin Ortland of the YouTube group Truth Unites, who has his own ideas as well about the historicity or how much of the Genesis 1 through 11 can be seen as actual or factual. Each one of these men see Genesis being non literal to some extent. Dr. Lennox, I think, is most closely related to seeing Genesis 1 and 2 and whatnot in a very literal way, as close to literal as they would come. And Dr. Craig and Michael Jones much further away. Now, our disagreement is not arising from a lack of trust or a lack of faith in God. It's arising from our skepticism in the modern scientific paradigm, our different levels of skepticism in the modern scientific paradigm. That is, how much do we trust modern science to be giving us the truth about our origins? Or perhaps a difference in the amount of knowledge that we have about, or the scientific knowledge that we have about this particular paradigm. Now, I don't mistrust the paradigm because I think that scientists are sitting in the back room rubbing their hands together, coming up with ways to lie to us. Most people outside of politics, anyway, really aren't like that. Rather, the entire apparatus of academia, research grants, how to get the money to do your job, how to get a doctorate, and to positions where you can get paid and to stay in those positions. Most of that is set up to teach and to confirm an old world viewpoint, an old earth viewpoint, without any consideration at all as to whether or not the premises of that viewpoint might actually be true or false. It doesn't matter. In other words, it isn't science, it isn't the science that speaks to the paradigm that I and other people distrust. Right? It's actually the system itself that coerces people into that paradigm, that's constructed to force everyone to come to the same conclusions about being an old Earth. And if they don't come to that conclusion, then they're just simply excluded. All of us are interested in the truth and in having a church united around Jesus Christ, around Jesus Christ. Each one of them is a believer, and we stand shoulder to shoulder, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, our Savior, and showing Him to the world. And someday we'll all be with Christ together in paradise. Throughout the history of the church, we've we've always argued about this or that issue. I mean, all kinds of different things. And some of these things are important and others just frankly aren't important. And so we all understand that when Christ comes back to judge the world, all of our silly and foolish ideas, all these notions that we have, mine included, will finally be purged. Now you might ask, well, why doesn't God just purge these things now? Well, let's think to yourself. If you were God and you've been around, oh, I don't know, a few quadrillion years already, and these humans, they're going to be around for a few quadrillion years. Are you really that concerned about them getting all of everything about reality right all in the first, 100 years? Or are you more concerned with perhaps they'll get it eventually? On to Genesis chapter 1. Now, when we're reading the Bible, we need to start by asking ourselves a few questions. Who wrote it? I mean, like each piece, not just the whole thing, but each piece of the Bible we're going to read. Who wrote it? Who did they write it to? What was the historic situation? What's the genre of the material they were writing? Because let's face it, when you're reading a literal narrative, or maybe you're reading something that's a non-literal poetry, or perhaps it's apocalyptic. There's different ways to read the material. How did the author come by that material? For some things, it doesn't really matter much, but for other things, it's really crucially important. And why was this or that material even mentioned? Authors don't actually have to say everything. In fact, authors exclude almost everything when they're writing. So you need to ask yourself, well, why did you mention that? And sometimes that can be fairly enlightening. So, Genesis chapter 1, who wrote it? Now, there's a two-part answer to this question. Who's writing this material, right? So we're saying that Moses is getting it from another place, but he's the editor. So we need to know something about Moses. Right? Moses was a member of the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. Moses was a powerful aristocrat. He was extremely well educated. He was, at least for the first chunk of his life extraordinarily rich. He had access to everything. He could, if he wanted, know all the things that Egypt had available throughout its entire history. And all the collected works of their history he had at his fingertips. Now, how much did he learn about that? We don't know. But what we can say is that everything that was contemporary, he had. He was taught the religion, he was taught the understanding, he was taught the culture, he was taught the traditions, he knew the taboos, he had it all. He wasn't just some guy coming in off the street who, I mean, who knows what subculture he came from. He wasn't in the subculture. He was in Pharaoh's house. He knew the official things. Now, he was nursed by his own mother after he was born, but he was raised in Pharaoh's household. How much did he learn from his mother? We don't know. Uh, Sometimes we say, well, I mean, surely she had to have taught him something. She would have taught him, about God. We actually don't know that. I mean, we don't know that it's not true, but we don't know that it is true. And he doesn't say that it happened. And that we should actually take with some level of importance because if he thought his faith in God was based upon what his mother had said, he probably would have mentioned that. That said, there are a lot of things that happen when we're young which impact us seriously, and we just don't remember them. So there may be a player in there. Um, Perhaps he heard about God when he went to Midian. When he moved to Midian after killing the Egyptian and running for his life, he ran into a man named Jethro, who was a Midianite priest who eventually becomes his father-in-law. A good move. And we know that Jethro was descended, because he was a Midianite, descended from Abraham and his wife, Keturah. In case you weren't aware that Abraham ends up with a wife named Keturah, read Genesis 25, 1 and 2. After Sarah dies, Abraham gets remarried. Well, if he's staying with this Midianite priest, well, then maybe that's what's going on. Maybe he's heard about God from Jethro. But on the other hand, did he say that? He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, Jethro taught Moses about God. He doesn't say that at all. So maybe Jethro was a priest of God. Maybe he was a priest to a different God. He just doesn't say at all. But what we do know is that when Moses runs into the burning bush, God talks to him. That we have. And Moses is deeply impacted by this event. And so our understanding is Moses may or may not have had some concept of who God was before that, but certainly at the burning bush, he knows who is talking to him because God tells him who's talking to him. I mean, he even asks, "Who are you?" And God gives him a name. So this is the point where we can say Moses certainly is now having faith in God. And of course, all those extra miracles sure don't hurt. All right, so two, where did Moses actually get the material from if he's the editor? Who actually wrote that material? Because Moses himself, he wasn't alive when any of the events of Genesis were recorded. And in the case of Genesis 1 in particular, I mean, who wrote that down? Because literally nobody was alive when Genesis 1 occurred, not other than God. One of the common misconceptions that we face is this historical idea that because Genesis was written, because Moses wrote Genesis after the Exodus, or as a lot of scholars think, that it was actually written during the exile period, much, much later down the road. That means that this story was based on Egyptian mythology, that the Egyptian mythology came first, and that Moses actually created his story based on Egyptian mythology. But that is an assumption, and it's an assumption that is based more upon a person's belief system than actual good historical analysis. What Moses is claiming in his narratives in Genesis is that his story is, in fact, older than the Egyptian story. In fact, we see this during one of the genealogies when he references, oh, yeah, and then the guy named Egypt was born. Egypt, the father of the Egyptians, was actually born. His stories predate their stories. And if he's right in this claim, then all of Egyptian mythology descends from the story that Moses is putting out in Genesis itself. All right, who did he write this material to? And in this case, we're not talking about just Genesis 1, but who did he write all of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to, the Pentateuch? Well, let's start with the basics. He didn't write it to you. He didn't write it to me. Unless you happen to be a Jew, in which case you can make the argument that he did write it to you. Most specifically, who did he write it to? Moses was writing to a group of people who had been slaves in Egypt. They were coming out of Egypt. They had been there for the last 400 plus years. They're coming out of Egypt and they're living in a very specific culture, one that is steeped in Egyptian mythology. And they are learning the new ways. They're learning the law and they need to learn this law. And so Moses is teaching it to them. But Genesis, he said, is a foundation for this law. So this is who he's writing to. They don't know anything yet. They don't know anything about God. All they know are the Egyptian gods. They are pagans. This is what they are. Their faith in God is very, very, very basic. So, what was the historical situation? Well, depending upon who you believe, it's either in the 1200s or the 1400s BC. And we have here no scripture in existence. I mean, Moses is writing the beginning of scripture. And if there are other writings, for example, where Moses got his information from, they're completely lost to us. So maybe they had some things, but would you expect that they were reading these things? There's no reason to think so. So the situation is that you've got a lot of clueless people who were just slaves, who are now no longer slaves. And quite frankly, they're wandering through the desert in Sinai and they're following what they've been told is God, who appears in daytime like a cloud and at night like a pillar of fire. They're just going where they're told to go because they don't know what they're doing. Everything is being provided to them. So, what is the genre of the material? Genesis 1, as it turns out, is highly disputed. In fact, it could be the most highly disputed text in all the scripture as to what its genre is. Why? Because if Genesis 1 is not literal historical narrative and it's instead, say, poetry, then we could interpret the words of the text figuratively. For example, we could easily justify interpreting the days of creation as non literal days. If the genre is narrative or a literal summary, then this is a much harder argument to make. So, why is this so difficult to resolve? Well, because we as Christians don't agree on what happened regarding the creation of the world. And you can blame that on modern science, if you will, but we simply don't agree. We know that God didn't lie to us, so the question is not whether or not he's wrong. God's never wrong. The question is whether we are misinterpreting the text that was given to us. Is the creation supposed to be read as 7 literal days? Or is the creation supposed to be read in some other non literal way? Opening the Bible with a highly disputed text is it's certainly unhelpful, and it's unhelpful for reinforcing the validity of the scriptures. Fortunately for us, when we're interpreting the text, we don't need to treat it as disputed. Dr. William Lane Craig, while I disagree with him on the genre, provides us an easy way out of this argument. Even if we classify the material as mythohistory, as he would suggest, we should still read it for its intent as though it is history. And this allows us to set the argument over the historicity of the story and of the material, set it to the side, and to read the text as literal narrative for the lessons that it has to show us. Next, the question is, how did Moses come by his material? Obviously, Moses was not an eyewitness to what happened during the vast period of time before he was born. So it's a fair question to ask how he came about that material. Now, when I was young, I was taught that oral traditions had been passed down from father to son for hundreds and hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years, that this is the way that knowledge was kept. And certainly we know from history that cultures who depend upon oral tradition do an excellent job of retaining their knowledge throughout the ages and through rote memorization from the elders to children. And a child who grows up in that culture without having any television or video games or pretty much anything else to do with their life can memorize huge stories and collections of material. When memories begin to fade, checking memory against other members of the tribe can keep the stories from changing significantly. So perhaps this is how the stories came down from the days of Noah, for example, to Moses. Maybe, though, this isn't actually the whole story. You see, I was also taught as a child that writing was invented in Sumer. From there, it was taken to Egypt, and from there spread to the rest of the world. But it turns out, however, that that story is actually not correct. Quite to the contrary, writing has been independently developed at least 4 separate times in Sumer, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, and in China. And this isn't to say that it hasn't been developed elsewhere as well. There are many languages throughout history that have been developed that may have developed writing on their own, and we just don't have sufficient knowledge to know one way or the other. So the point is this: writing is not a unique invention. It's discoverable by any culture that sees a sufficient advantage to using it. That is to say, that when writing will solve significant problems for a culture, such as recording contracts or sending complex messages long distances, or maybe even maintaining a violently complex tax code like our own, it can develop easily. And the reason for this is that drawing pictures is innate to humans. From the time that you're 2 years old or even less, drawings appear on rocks and in caves as far back as humans have been on the earth, whether you would consider that to be 5 or 6 thousand years or 100,000 years. Drawings of people, animals, and geometric shapes. What we call writing is actually a series of small steps of logic coming from this. First, there are random drawings, just simply because I can draw the thing. Ooh, a buffalo. I draw it. And then the drawings were put into some semblance of order where, oh yeah, there was that time, the two buffaloes, and then there's Bill and I, and we had beer. And so now you got some semblance of an order to beginning to tell a story, and you add more and more and more to that. These um, these drawings serve to act as images for the storytelling for the hearers who are hearing it, or they become themselves reminders of the stories that the storytellers are telling. So if I put up all the elements for a story up on the cave wall, then later on my children and their children and their children will remember that story because they'll remember, oh yes, this happened, that this happened, that this happened, that this happened. Over time, more symbols can be added that represent ideas or complex thoughts that can't be drawn. For example, love. In modern American culture, we would use a heart to represent love. There's nothing innate about the symbol of a heart that indicates that it should be love. It's just a symbol that we all recognize that way because we've all been taught like that. Quite frankly, you look at the texting world, we've got all kinds of complex codes and which images are used to represent this and that that I always get wrong, and my kids tell me that I have absolutely no idea how to properly use text and emojis. That's okay. I don't want to know. So this much can all be done over the course of a single generation. All of that can be developed in one generation, and then over the course of a few generations, more rules would be added in order to solidify the methodology of this writing into something we would call syntax, or to uh, from there to shorten the complex pictures. I got my Buffalo, but he's really hard to draw, so I'm going to create a simpler and a simpler and a simpler form of representing him until it ends up so simple. There are things that we call letters. And then at that point, you're off to the races with a full-blown writing system. So if it's that simple, why don't we see every group of people in history doing this? Well, just because it's simple doesn't mean that everyone is going to find it important enough to develop or to retain it. Most people groups in history weren't even big enough, for that matter, or they didn't engage in long distance trade or have complex commerce or have complex negotiations with a foreign king, which is the story from Sumer as to how their writing developed. Um, and and if you had a neighbor who had already developed a writing system, you didn't need to develop your own. Why develop one if you could just steal theirs? Which is the reason why cuneiform became so popular. The biggest limiting factor in our understanding of ancient writing, though, is actually because of its absolute transient nature. Whether or not a piece of writing survives through history is completely dependent upon what it is written on. Let's say, for example, that I'm a member of an early tribe, let's see, in southern Italy, and our tribe grew quickly, began trading with the various islands around it, and so because of that trade, we needed to have a writing system. So we develop a writing system of local, for local contracts and to track who's bringing how much material to the king so we can keep taxation right. And we take all of this information that we're collecting, all this writing, we're not sticking it on the walls. We're not putting it in stone. We're not putting it in clay because that's just not what we're using. We're putting it on animal skins because we got plenty of animal skins. We're using them all the time. So we're marking it in some sort of ink on animal skins. And we stack them all very nicely and neatly in the administrative building. Now, as happens to every single civilization, at some point in time, our civilization collapses. And maybe fires rip through the area. Maybe the area is flooded out. Maybe not. Maybe it just simply goes into the dust. 3,000 years later, some archaeologist digs the place up. And they're going to find, well, a bunch of pottery, because you always find pottery. And they're going to find maybe some objects that we traded with, like glass or jars of salt or beads or whatever. They won't find any writing. Now we had meticulously maintained all this writing, but they won't find any. Why is that? Well, the answer is because we put on animal skins. Within 1 to 200 years, it all rotted away. Few materials that humans have used for writing can actually survive thousands of years. This is why writing on clay tablets, on cave walls, on the insides of stone temples, or packing the writing away into sealed dry pottery has been so important. Time, along with decay, moisture, erosion, it destroys virtually everything. So let's say, just for theorizing, that Moses had access to the writing of the patriarchs, just for theory. That is, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the rest, and anybody even older than that. Let's say he had writing from before the flood. Let's say that was all something that had become available to him down through time. And let's say that they had used materials for writing that were very common at the time. Common materials for writing. That's animal skins, maybe a little papyrus, wood slats, or even bone. These would stick around as long as people actively took care of them and copied them when they were getting too old. But if not, if they didn't copy them, then they would disappear the same way the leftovers in your refrigerator do. Just rot away. Now, am I saying that certainly Noah packed a library on the ark before he loaded up the animals? No, I'm not saying that. We don't know that that's what occurred. But I would say that if writing already existed in whatever language Noah spoke or other people spoke, and if he had access to that library, then he certainly would have packed it onto the ark before loading the animals. People throughout history, all the wise people throughout history, have always taken the writing or the artwork if they could. But again, how long would it last afterward? His library over the ages, if it weren't cared for, would have fallen into disrepair and been erased from history. Only snippets and stories would have remained. Rumors about a great flood, or about the amazing and wicked world that existed before it happened, legends about a tree of life and a snake. But for anyone who kept writing themselves, for anyone who kept those writings for themselves and took the time, the effort, and the expense to maintain those, the stories wanted to become legends or mythology. The stories wanted to just become feelings of the past. Instead, they would have remained just history. And that history could then be passed from one generation to the next to the next. Now, am I just spitting this theory out of whole cloth? I mean, is there any evidence for this? First, I appeal to a sensible and rational and simple explanation for the many complex stories that are in Genesis. Genesis is not a series of simple stories. It doesn't come across like an epic, or it's not written like poetry. That's not what it is. It's fixed stories that have detail in them. Many of these stories could have been more sensational or more blunt, encountering the Egyptian gods, for example, if Moses had been making them up. He could have made them very bluntly against the Egyptians. Like, for example, let's say, well, instead of Lot being captured by the kings of Mesopotamia and Abraham running off and rescuing Lot from the kings of Mesopotamia, why not Pharaoh? I mean, why not just go for the throat? Yeah, Pharaoh came in and he captured Lot, and Abraham got a bunch of guys together, went over there and beat him up. Why not? But you see, that's not what happened. What about others of Moses' ancestors who did gruesome and horrible things? And in the text, you understand that they're gruesome and horrible things. And certain sons of uh, Jacob end up getting cursed for their bad behavior. Well, he could have cleaned that up or just not written it down if he were making up the stories. It'd be easy enough to do. But the very fact that these things speak derogatorily of Moses' ancestors or the Hebrews in general actually speaks to the legitimacy. This is actually something historians understand is that, hey, when somebody says something bad about their own people, it's more likely to be true than if they're just saying grand and glorious things. Because rarely do people record the bad things about themselves. And so merely that piece of information itself suggests that these stories are true and they're carried down in great detail. So what I'm saying is that writing is actually a simpler explanation than having oral tradition for these things. Writing makes the explanation easy. And when you're trying to understand history, you want to, as much as possible, appeal to the simplest reason, simplest cause. Second, Moses himself actually gives us a piece of evidence in the text. It's a single word found in Genesis 5:1. And we don't know why he put it in only one place, but he does. He only puts it in one place where Moses says, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam." The Hebrew word there is seper or seper, and it refers only to written material. It does not refer to oral material. It's only written material. And so Moses is claiming with this one word, just as significant as if you wrote that word, trying to tell somebody, I wrote this down or this was written down. He is saying with this single word that what he is using is written material. Now, why was this or that material mentioned? That was a long time I spent talking about writing, I'll tell you. Why was this or that material mentioned? Genesis 1, the material of Genesis 1. Why is Moses giving it to us? Okay. Particularly in the old world where writing things down and transmitting it, it was a bit more complicated than simply tapping away on a keyboard like I get to do. I can I can pump out reams of writing, whereas in the past it was hard to do. For me, it's really cheap. I could put down 100,000 words for the same price I could put down one, other than the time. For them, I mean, the more words you put down, the more material you had to, you know, to have to write it on. You had to carry that with you. If you transcribed it from one to the next, you had to copy every letter by hand from one thing to the next. It was much more expensive to do. So, why did Moses take the time to write Genesis 1? For this, we need to understand the background of where Moses was. So, like we had talked about, what was going on here? Well, they're coming out of Egypt. Egypt is the background of all of this. And Egyptian mythology, Egyptian religion is the background of where Moses is coming from. Remember, in the Exodus, when they are leaving Egypt, there is a war taking place. And the war is not between the Egyptian people and the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people want to quit. And they're just like, I give up. Let's go back to slavery. That's not the war. The war is taking place between God on one hand and the Egyptian gods on the other. And it's a blowout. And why is it a blowout? Because as God is pointing out, he exists and they don't. I mean, you're going to be a blowout. Imagine playing chess against nobody. You're going to win. Okay, so this is the war. So the background is their mythology. And so it would be helpful to understand something about their mythology. Namely, in Genesis 1, Moses is writing about the creation of the world. The Egyptians had lots of ideas about the creation of the world. Lots of ideas. Way too many ideas. Keep in mind that Egyptian history is fairly long. You've got, what, I don't know, 1,000+ years of imagination of various priests in various different cities at various different times, all trying to make a name for themselves. Tons and tons of gods to work with. This guy prefers that guy prefers that god. And so their creation stories, it's not that they evolved in some sort of linear fashion, they scattered all over. There are lots of creation ideas. So I'm going to tell you one representative story. In other words, if you actually know a lot about Egyptian history, you're going to say, well, that's not the way I heard it. Right. Every single element of the story could be disagreed to by some Egyptian priest somewhere serving some god at some point in time. Every single element. But I'm going to give you basically a representative story that, as best as I could tell from my reading, is fairly representative of what was in place at about the time that the Hebrews were in Egypt. And it goes something like this. In the beginning, the earth was covered in water and devoid of order. A group of 8 gods and goddesses, called the Ogdoad, the uncreated infinites, caused land to rise out of the water. They created Atum, the first god, and the sun. Atum then created Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. They then gave birth to Nut, the sky goddess, and Geb, the earth god. These birthed Osiris, god of fertility and the afterlife, Isis, goddess of motherhood and magic, Seth, god of chaos and storms, and Nephthys, goddess of protection. Together they pushed back against the chaos to create order and truth. With more gods and goddesses came more creation, as each god or goddess added something new to the creation. Now, like I said, there are lots of variations. For example, Re, the god of the sun, comes raw, coming from an egg. Versions where Atum is self-generated. There is no Ogdoad. Others where Ogdoad, they lose control to the chaos and it overtakes them, and it's all very bad. Right? So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 1. And I love Genesis. That is why you are suffering through this with me. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. I'm going to be reading out of the NIV. And why do I read out of the NIV? Is it because it's a better text? No, it's because it's the text I grew up with, and so I like it. But there are many, many great versions you can read out of. If you're really trying to understand it, you should really read out of like 3 or 4 or 5 different versions to try to see where different translators, parsed Hebrew words together differently in order to get different flavor. It's a general good rule of thumb that if all the translators for all the different versions all agree with each other on something, you shouldn't go looking for a different opinion at that point. Because if they all agree, it's because the text in the Hebrew is clear. But if they disagree a lot, then what you're learning is that maybe the text isn't entirely clear. So it could be any one of them that actually has exactly what Moses intended. Um, but where disagreements like that happen, usually you'll end up with like a footnote in your Bible. Okay. Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, what do we get from this? Well, first of all, we are establishing when this is taking place. It's at the beginning. We're starting right at the beginning. Moses isn't starting us at the beginning of Egypt. He's starting us at the beginning. We are going all the way back to the beginning. Who is doing the work? Who is doing the work is Elohim. Elohim is the plural noun for God. The noun for God is El. He is using the plural for that, which is Elohim. They don't put an S on the end, it's not L's. Um, but when he's talking about God, he always uses a singular verb. And the easy way to see this in English is if I say, um, uh, I can say I am walking to the store, or we are walking to the store. But if I say we am walking to the store, it kind of hurts your ears a little bit. The reason why is because am is a singular verb, but we is a plural pronoun, and so it's problematic to us right off the bat. But he's going to do this consistently throughout the text, and just the whole Old Testament is replete with this. Elohim becomes as a plural noun for meaning loosely meaning gods or the divine beings or creators, uh, becomes the term for God Himself. Becomes one of the many terms that God uses for Himself. Moses is not going to allow any room in Genesis for there being a pantheon, any room at all. This is going to be staunchly monotheistic. And that is his first stab against the Egyptian gods. Now, this establishes the authorship of reality itself. It is God who has created the heavens and the earth. The last thing this verse does is it establishes perspective. And this isn't so important for the Hebrews because they already had this perspective, but it's actually important for us because we need to understand what the terms were that they were using by which they understood reality. Because the question is, what does the cosmos look like? And for the Hebrews, the cosmos consisted of two realms. There were the heavens and there was the earth. And the earth was an infinite plane in every direction, and it consisted of the land and it consisted of the water. And when you're talking about the water, you have the seas, and then you've got the great deep or the abyss, well, which is the place you don't go because it's filled with chaos and it's filled with death. And then the heavens, that's the place where the birds are, the clouds are, the sun and the moon are there. That's where the gods would reside. That's the heavens. And it's important to understand that the people of that time, that was how they viewed reality. Why? Because they stood on earth. They had no telescopes. They couldn't see anything past what they could see with their own eyes. It's not that you should look at this perspective and say, well, those people were clearly ignorant and wrong. I shouldn't trust anything that they had to say. No, you could trust what they had to say from their perspective. And isn't that what all of us have to say about anything? We always speak from our perspective if things are true. I mean, just consider this. I say the sun rose this morning. Did it really, or did the earth rotate? I mean, seriously, who gets up in the morning and looks at their wife and says, "Oh, the earth rotated so beautifully this morning. Did you see that?" No, they're going from their perspective of the world consists, this is the cosmos consists of the heavens and the earth. And we need to understand that as we read the rest of the text. Verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty or void. Darkness was over the face of the deep or over the surface of the deep. It is the abyss, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So very much like um the way the Egyptians would look at it from the get-go is you have the great deep, and we're starting here. So earth is formless and void, and darkness is over the face of the waters. There's chaos. There's just chaos all over the place. It is a big mess because the abyss is that is the zone of chaos. And where did all this chaos come from? Well, we could make the argument, well, the chaos was just pre-existent. It's just always been there, and that God has come down to where there is chaos and he is doing something with that chaos. And Moses isn't going to tell us. He's not going to say, well, there was some period of time where this or that happened, and this is why this is so chaotic. He's not even going to go there. He's just not. Okay. He is not answering the question as to whether between, between verses 1 and 2 and verse 3, between this part where it says God created and that part where God says let there be light, how much time is involved in it. He doesn't care. He doesn't talk about it. It's not interesting to him. He's not going to be involved in that question. Instead, he's taking this much more practical light. Let's say, for example, you make clay bowls, okay, and you love making clay bowls. I don't know why. It sounds horribly messy to me, but let's say you like doing it. Okay. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your clay and you're going to put a lump of clay on top of your platter to start working on it. I am going to notice that when you take that lump of clay and put it on the platter, it's not already done. It's kind of chaotic. It's a mess. It's terrible. Why? Because you just started. You have just begun. You're going to work on this thing. And so instead, you should look at this creation story as in God has created this thing and it's chaotic. Now he's going to work on it. That's how you should look at this. Whether there's some long period of time or not, wholly doesn't matter. It's just God created this thing and now he's going to work on it. It's like a lump of clay. Although I suppose in this case, it's a lump of giant water with dirt and magma and stuff on the inside. It's great. All right. The first step is always a mess. Now, the heavens are not mentioned here. Why? Because the earth is in chaos, but not the heavens. Why? Well, because the heavens aren't in chaos. Why? Well, God dwells there. You see, think in their minds, that's the heavens. That's where God dwells. Everything's cool there. But the Spirit of God, who would live in the heavens, has come to the earth. He's not in the heavens now. He's now on the earth, hovering over the waters. Now, hovering is the word rakaf. By the way, my Hebrew is horrible. So if I get it right, it's sheer dumb luck. The word is rakaf. It indicates a very soft presence. In Deuteronomy 32:11, we can see it's like a bird caring for its young, hovering over its young, taking care of them. This isn't like an attack helicopter. And you can see later in the Gospels where, the Holy Spirit comes down as a dove and lights on Jesus over the waters of the Jordan. It's the same sense of this hovering, this positive, peaceful presence. He is going to do good work. He's not hostile. He's coming to do good things. Now, verses 3 and 4. And God said, let there be light. and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. By the way, right here, Moses punches Ra directly in the face. You see, Ra was the sun god. That is, he was the god of light. And he was created via some world egg or whatever their story was at the time for how he was created. He's the god of light. He's the god of the sun. The sun, it's his eye. It burns. Well, Moses just took Ra and went right off the table. Tossed him, just completely tossed. Doesn't even bother mentioning him because he's not important. There's actually another reason which we'll get to later. He doesn't mention Ra because Ra's not there. God created light. Ra doesn't create light. God, Elohim, he creates light. He doesn't create a God of light. He doesn't create a God to take care of the light for him. He just simply creates the light. Why? Because light comes from God. This is the power of God. He creates light from speech. He just simply says. Now, the Egyptian gods have to use objects to create things because that was as far as their creativity went, I guess. They would use objects to create things. God, he doesn't. He just go, I just right out of his mouth, things come. Now, what is light and darkness? Light is good. How do we know this? Because God saw that the light was good. You notice he doesn't say the darkness was good. He says the light was good. Light is good. It's not that darkness is evil. It's just simply that the darkness was not good. Okay, he splits the light from the darkness. He takes the good thing and he puts it here, and he takes the thing that isn't good and he splits it out. He's taking good and separating it from things that aren't good. He is putting order into the chaos. He's starting order. And note, it's not a struggle for him. He's not having to fight with it. Because remember, the gods would have to fight against chaos and would fight to establish truth and order. God's not fighting. He just speaks and it happens. Because God, unlike an Egyptian god, is powerful. The darkness is chaos, it's void, it's without, it's nothing, it's not ordered. It just isn't. And light is. Now, after separating light from dark, he has evening and he has morning, but only the light is good. Thus, what he's doing is he's creating two time periods. There is an evening, that's when darkness comes, and there is a morning when light comes. There are times when not good things occur. That's not evil things. We're not saying that, but just the not good things. And then the times when the good things. This is the day. And we replay this again, sort of in when we talk about seasons in verse 14. This sounds a lot like it comes across a lot like the philosophy of cyclic nature or of a cyclical reality, and it ends up feeling like it's like an Eastern religion or something like that. And the reason why it feels like that is because folks in the East observed this about reality, and then they codified it into a religion. Just because somebody codifies something into a false religion doesn't mean it's automatically false. Okay? It just means that they made an observation about something that's true and they codified it falsely. This kind of thing happens all the time. You know, it's like when they say, "Wow, stuck clock is right twice a day." It's that kind of thing. There's a cyclical nature to this. The day and the night, the day and then the night. The seasons come and the seasons go. You see this in other places throughout the Bible. You can see, for example, the cyclical nature in Judges of the repentance, and then the people fall, and then they repent, and then they fall. Or when Solomon in Ecclesiastes is talking about there's a time for this and a time for that, and a time for that, and a time for that. Um, Jesus, when Jesus is talking uh, in about when his disciples will end up fasting. This isn't the time for them to fast. I'm here with them. They're not going to fast. When I am gone, they will fast. We rejoice with those who rejoice. We mourn with those who mourn. And there will always be rejoicing. There will always be mourning, and they happen at different times. So if the light is good and darkness is not good, why have darkness at all? I mean, why not just like do light all the time? Wouldn't that be great? Similar questions to this that we ask nowadays. Why is there a Satan? Why hasn't God eliminated Satan? Why do we have evil? Why hasn't God eliminated evil? Why is there suffering? There are lots of questions. They're the same basic thing, which is why is there the not good, or even worse, evil? Why not just always have the good? Well, God is creating a world, and in this world, He is going to make certain things occur. He wants certain things to be in place. And one of these things He wants to have in place is choice. He is going to create humans, and humans must make choices. And so God has put them into a world where there is light and there is dark. There is the good, and then there's the not good. And it is for man to make decisions. You will choose this and reject that. You live in one, and you're going to sleep through the other. You're going to have to make a decision about how you live. In time, this will be repealed. In time. At the end of time, this will be repealed. You see, at the end, what we get, what's given to us in the New Testament is there is going to be a time when instead of having a land where you have both light and darkness, instead it gets divided. There will now be two lands. And in one, there will always be light. And in the other, there will always be darkness. Well, how do you choose which one to live in? Ah, there's the rub. You make that decision in this land where you have both available to you. And then your decision from this land will become permanent in the next, where the people who've chosen light will live in the land of light, and the people who've chosen darkness will live in the land of darkness. And so it's both metaphysical, but it's also very real. It's also very physical. What about the land of light? We see in Revelation 22:5, where it says literally, there will be no more night. It's going away. The place that we call heaven, there will be no more night. It will be just daytime. Oh, that's going to mess up my sleep schedule, I'll tell you. About hell, you look at Matthew 25:30. Throw that worthless servant out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, a land of just darkness. So for today, for this part of creation, there is both light and dark. But when God recreates, it will be two lands, one of light, one of dark. Okay, some other things to pull out of here. This is the very beginning of understanding that God is going to talk about himself in a split way. And as Christians, we understand that there is a Trinity. I'm not going to say we understand the Trinity, uh, but we understand that there is a Trinity in which God exists, where he is three persons in one God. And you see the first indication that he is splitting his understanding of himself here. Um, let's see here. Okay, because the first two you get the God who speaks, and then at the same time you have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. You got the Spirit of God who's present, and then you have also the God who speaks. And when we pull in John 1, where God said, where God says, where John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What he's adding in here is understand there's a third player here. It's not just the God who speaks and the God who's present, but also the God who is the speech. You see, the Word of God itself, the Word of God itself is in fact also God. Because notice what power that word wields. That power that word wields because the Word of God itself is also God. He's God all the way through. Verse 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So here we see God is ordering the universe. He's defining day and night, and again, day. When he defines day, He's actually he actually merges day and night into the same concept of being a day. He kind of like buries the word night in there. Um, names the light day, the dark he names night, and then together they are day. And why is that? Well, the reason, the simple reason is because we are to be children of the day. I mean, that's what we are supposed to be. Remember, we're supposed to follow the light. We're not supposed to follow the darkness. We're supposed to follow the light. Sleep through the dark. The other thing you have to keep in mind in case you start getting, planets and whatnot in your head, remember, we're not talking about planets and galaxies and nebulae and whatnot. Everything has to be looked at from you got the heavens and the earth. That is our perspective. Verses 6 to 8. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water, or a firmament, or some other term here. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. Okay. Um, in the Egyptian story, remember that the land actually rises up out of the sea. Moses is tossing them. And you can say, well, this is kind of a small detail. Okay, call it a small detail if you will, but it's at least interesting. When Moses is telling the story, what he's saying is God drove the water away. Okay, it's not that the land rose up out of the water, God drove the water away. He's not driving it away side to side. It's not going east and west. Instead, he actually is separating the water below and he's putting water above. He's pushing water up, 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 and away. The land you see was already there under the water. It was already there. The water, there's just too much water, so he's driving water off. Now, where in the world did all that water go? Drive the water off. It just went into the sky. And he's saying he put a vault up there, or a firmament, a firm thing, or something. There's something. He calls it sky. There's something to keep the water up there from the water down here. What is he saying here? Well, he's saying the water went up past the archway of the sky. Okay. Um, archway. By the way, that the archway of the sky, which that's gonna try to call it, called the firmament in many places. It's the word rakia. And in the Egyptian view, this was the function of the Egyptian god Nut, the sky goddess. She was a bit of a nut. She served the function, and she's the one who holds the sky. What's in the sky above, the heavens above, from the earth to protect the earth from whatever's in the heavens. And Moses has just taken her on, just completely eliminated her. She has no place in creation. She doesn't exist. There is no goddess Nut. God simply made a thing and it functions because when God makes things, they function. So here's a great question. If Moses is talking about a firmament where there's water sitting above it, I don't see any water up there. We send stuff up into space. There's no water up there. So this is a myth, right? Let's say you say, usually what happens when you ask questions like that, you have no ability to sit in the other camp and to say, no, no, I'm going to take this literally. Just go ahead and say, no, I'm going to accept it as literally true. Now, from that position, how do I defend it? This will always serve you well in life if you assume the other guy's position and try to argue from his position as vigorously as you're willing to argue from yours. Okay? What is a person who believes a literal statement going to say? That there's water up there? No. You can look up there. There's no water there. Okay? If it's literally true, then what does this verse say? Well, it says that God ejected water off the earth. I don't know how he did it. Maybe he used his hands, threw it off. Or maybe he threw meteors at the earth and blasted water off into space. Okay. And if it's out there, well, where is it? Don't know. What if you launch something into space, where's it go? Well, I mean, lots of it gets pulled into the sun, I suppose. Maybe it just leaves out. Who knows? Maybe it all landed on Mars, and that's why we have water on Mars. It went away. I don't have to explain where exactly it went. I'm just going to point out it left. So he blasts the water off the earth. Why? Because there's too much. Why did God make an earth with too much water? He can start with a lump of clay. He's working on it. Give him some space. Okay, verses 9 and 10. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters, he called them seas. And God saw it was good. Now, this is a little bit of a repetition of what we've already seen. God driving water out to the above. Now, God is emptying water off the land. He's completing his work of creating the land by taking the rest of the water off of it. And the plainest way to read this is, well, the water is just literally what's left of it is shedding off the land. It's like a flood going back into the sea. It's leaving. And this would be a very familiar sight to the Hebrews who were quite familiar with the Nile River flooding every single year. It floods and then the water goes away. Again, God is the one ordering things. He names land and sea. The seas, they're contained, they're not overwhelming the land. And he's using a different word for the sea here. He's using the word yam, and he's not using the word for abyss or deep, which is tehom. Um, Tehom, the abyss, as we talked about, is a religious concept. It was the primordial chaos. It will reappear later when we're talking about the flood because the whole earth is being flooded in this. It's not like the way they didn't separate Yam and Tahom the way we do when we think of ocean and sea, because, we have big maps and we look and we say, well, this is a huge body of water. I'm going to call that an ocean, and that's a much smaller body of water, and that's a sea. From their perspective, they're all huge. I mean, they're all gigantic. So this is not how they saw them. Instead, um, they're seeing them more in a I don't have a good way to describe it. Doesn't matter. The point is you've got the Yam, which you have some semblance of control. You don't have control over it, but you can ride upon it. And then you've got the Great Abyss, the Tahom, which that's where bad things are, and they kill you. So you just don't go there, at all. God sees that it's good. He looks at it. Aha! He did a good job. And wouldn't you know, when God does things, He does a good job. In fact, He's almost a little bit like me that way. When I see things that I did good, and I'm like, oh yay me. That doesn't happen often. As with light and sky, it's God who makes the seas and contains them. Notice he doesn't have another God out there. There's no other God out there needed to make this or that sea, to contain this or that water. He does all of it. He fills the roles of all of the other gods, which is the reason why I suppose he can have a plural word for himself, because he is that awesome. Now, the word good, it's popped up a couple of times. You should talk about it. It's the word tov. In English, we often use this word to separate um, things that are righteous from things that are evil. We talk about what is good and what is bad. This is why I've been saying, well, this is good and this is not good. It's not that it's evil, it's just not good. Because the word carries a much fuller meaning. It carries the meaning of that which is beneficial, which is pleasing, what is well designed, what is doing what its function to do. We can view it the same way we would if we looked at having a good car and a bad car. What's a good car and a bad car? A good car is the car that gets me where I want to go, and a bad car isn't. It doesn't work. There's not a moral judgment on the cars. It's not like, well, car, you deserve to go to heaven and you deserve to go to hell. You know, it's going to go to the crusher, but it's not a moral judgment at all. There's no moral judgment. It's just about that which functions the way it's supposed to function and that which does not function the way it should function. They also use to define good and evil, but we need to look at it in the sense this more this fuller meaning of functionality. And there is in Hebrew a standard of goodness. Tov has a standard, and that is God. God is the standard of good, not just the standard of doing all the right things, but a standard of doing all the things that function properly. Mark 10:18. No one is good but God alone. James 1:17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights. I know somebody's going to say, well, Tov is a Hebrew word. They were in Greek. You're right, they were, but it's the same concept of goodness. The things that function properly, the standard for that is God. And this, when he's talking about this is good, this is what he means. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Verses 11 to 13. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. It was working exactly what it was supposed to. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Okay, we have more details of creation here. Not so much the big gigantic seas thing, but now we've got creating all these little things, plants all over the place, different kinds of plants. And again, are you noticing all the Egyptian gods that aren't involved? Oh, bummer. You see, Egypt had numerous gods that were involved in every tiny detail of creation, and Moses goes and knocks them right off the table. God creates all of the flora. And when he creates all of the flora, everything from the cactus, yes, the cactus, to the redwood trees or whatever he's created in the flora, it's all good. That means it is well ordered, properly designed. It's going to function the way it's supposed to function. Verses 14 and 19. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky above the archway. Let there be lights to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights, in the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth. So if God already made light, why do you add two lights? I mean, wasn't there already light? Or the question that gets inversely asked is, well, now without the sun and the moon, how is there light? There's no way. There can be no way there was light. People ask great questions, don't they? Okay, so first and foremost, why add two lights? This separates the idea. Well, he creates light initially, and now he's creating lights for light. He's separating the idea of light itself from the sun and the moon. You see, it's not actually the sun that is ultimately the source of light. The sun is not ultimately the source of light. Revelations 22:5. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun. The Lord God will give them light. You see, the sun is not ultimately the source of light. I mean, in modern cosmology, we totally understand this. The sun's kind of a small pittance compared to some other stars. They are really pumping out light. See, the sun itself is a source of light. It's a lamp. It's just a lamp that God stuck into the sky for us. God is the source of light. God is going to step back from this role, however, because he's creating creation to function on its own. And so he creates two lamps. He creates a lamp which actually produces the light called the sun, and then a little lesser lamp which is like a giant mirror called the moon. It really is like a giant mirror. The sun is the governor or the ruler or the authority over the daytime. That is, he's actually given authority to the sun. That is a tool, not the eye of Ra. He's given it to a tool to function as the governor of daytime. He's like, what decisions is it making? Well, really, when the sun rolls around, it's daytime. And when the sun's not around, it's not daytime anymore. That's how it's functioning as a governor or a ruler. It doesn't have to be smart, it just has to do its job. And we see this scientifically as completely obvious. I mean, look, light comes from constant fusion happening on the sun, big explosions all the time. But, the Hebrews 3,500 years ago, you know what they didn't know? They had no idea why the sun was bright. I mean, it just was. It was just always like that. It's a constant up there in the sky. Okay, so these are also made for signs and seasons. We can use them to track time, to understand the past, and to prepare for the future. And at least at this point in time, while he mentions that there will be sacred times, he doesn't mention any of them yet. But we'll get to that by the end of the chapter. Okay, verses 20 to 23. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. Okay, so God's creating all the sea creatures and he's creating all of the birds. Now, why these two particular groups? Well, remember the domain of man is on land. And most of us understand that because we walk pretty good here, but we're really terrible at flying and we're only so good at swimming. So God is putting creatures in the not man places first. He's putting them up in the sky, remember, across the archway of the sky, on this side of that archway, and out into the seas. Now, something that's missed a little bit in the English, but is very much there in the Hebrew, is when we're talking about the creatures in the sea. And this is just kind of neat. So God created the great creatures of the sea. That's what it says here in the NIV. Except, what does that actually mean? So the term for this is Tanin Gadol. These are the mighty sea monsters. These are the great creatures of the abyss, the ones that God has created and put out there. The other gods, the Egyptian gods, the Canaanite gods, any other gods out there would have to go out and fight these creatures and try to defeat them. And it would be hard. That maybe they would win, but maybe the monsters will win because they're so powerful. And yet these are the very creatures that God just simply says, "I'm creating that. That one's Fred. I like it. He's my friend." You see, the God that Moses is talking about, he's just that much bigger, far above and beyond what the Egyptian gods could pretend to be. All right, 24 and 25. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Now, there's no way you can hit this point without noticing the number of times according to their kinds shows up. It's the Hebrew word min or min or min. Yeah, it means it's differentiated, it's categorized by distinct families. Animals, when God made them, would come from their own kind over and over. There would be cats, and they would produce cats and cats and cats. They wouldn't produce dogs and cows. So animals are not coming as a mishmash. They're not generic animals. And no, Moses isn't trying to combat evolution here because, again, Moses doesn't know anything about evolution. He's never heard of this. So why is he mentioning this? Well, it's not the gods who are doing this. It's not the gods who are coming and making sure that certain things are repopulating or regenerating. They just do it on their own because God has designed for this to occur. God designed for it to happen. It has nothing to do with the gods. And here on this particular day, because we're on day 6, no longer day 5, we're now filling the domain of humans. We're filling the domain of man. We're on the land. And it's all the different kinds of animals. It's the livestock. It is the wild animals. It's the creepy crawly things. It's anything that's under the earth. It's all the things. And in Egypt, there were supposed to be a myriad of different gods that were involved in this. And Moses mentions absolutely none of them because Elohim did it all. 26 and 27. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all of the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So God has now created a completely unique creation. He has now created man or mankind in his image, or as he says, in our image. This is the image of God, the Imagio Dei, uh, telem. It is the same word that is used for idol. It's an image or an idol. So, what is it that the Hebrews have been worshiping? They have been worshiping idols in Egypt. The Egyptians worship idols in Egypt. They are images of their gods. And yet, what Moses is saying here is that when God made mankind, he made mankind to be the likeness of himself. Making stone and wood and worshiping that is nonsense. We've already been made in the image of God. There's no sense having another thing. Now, this isn't a justification for bowing down and worshiping people. That's just silly at this point. I mean, does an idol bow down and worship another idol? That's nonsense. Instead, you have access to God yourself. You're made in his image. The second word, in his likeness, the muth, the likeness, the figure of. So we get this double, these two different words that are referencing the same kind of thing, reinforcing this point. You're made in God's likeness. Now, what does it mean to be made in God's likeness? You have the characteristics of God, many of them. You have free will, logic, emotion, purpose, creativity, passion, eternity. You have these because God has these and He's passed them on to you. What are some of the things that we don't have? Well, we're not purely spirit, we're physical beings. Um, we're not omniscient, we're not omnipresent, we don't have the omnis. We have to actually go out of our way in order to improve ourselves. We don't come automatically awesome. Okay, so the Imago Dei, that's the image of God. This is the basis for the value of all human life. And it's not handed out to a person because of their race or their status, how wealthy they are, or because they've reached a given age, whether or not they've been born yet, whether or not they're still valuable to society and they're not yet too old to function, whether or not they have a high enough IQ, or whether or not they have uh, sufficient means of working for the body politic. None of these things are taken into account. They don't matter. Whether the person has Down syndrome doesn't matter. Whether the person is unborn doesn't matter. If the person, if you just don't like the person, tough cookies. We are all made in the image of God, and because of that, we all have sacred value. Just think, in the old world, what would happen if you knocked down the statue, if you knocked down the idol of one of the gods of Egypt? What would they do to you? You'd be executed. You'd be finished because you have offended the God. You have gone after the image of the God. And so, what is Moses relating in this idea to people? If you come after another person and you mistreat them, you are offending the image of God. And in so doing, you are offending God Himself. No other creature is given this label. None. Just humans. And He's going to give it to men and women alike because it doesn't matter. Humanity here stands completely unique. You may not own other people. You may not kill, you may not murder other people. You may not oppress other people. You may not subdue other people. This is not what we are, what is to happen to each other. And if you do any of those things, you will pay the price because you have committed a wretched and horrible sin, not just against the other person, but because they're the image of God, you've created the offense against God Himself. Now, some of these characteristics that that we've been given as humans. Animals are given some of these characteristics. Some of them demonstrate, emotion, real emotion. Some of them seem to demonstrate an enormous amount of purpose or some level of creativity. But none of them demonstrates very much of it, in particular compared to humans. Now, one of the things that Moses does here in quoting God is, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness. When God refers to our, he's referring to himself in the plural there. He's talking about himself and who. This language is repeated again in Genesis 3 and in Genesis 11. So there are three schools of thought on this, unless there are more which I haven't found. The first one, and this is one I was taught when I was young, is that it's plural because God's awesome. It's often referred to as the royal we. This is a very popular idea. It says that, well, God refers to himself in the plural because, well, he's just that cool. And I'll give. God is definitely cool enough. I mentioned it earlier. God replaces all of the gods. And so, therefore, why not call himself we? Why not be in the plural? He does all the things. It's a popular idea. The problem with this, the idea of the royal we, it existed in England. This is a completely foreign idea to Egypt. Pharaoh didn't do this. When we read later, you'll see that Pharaoh, when he speaks about himself. I am going to do this. I am choosing to do this. I am doing these things. He doesn't say we. And so, why would Moses look at this and say, oh, it's completely appropriate to put down we for God? It's something that I guess an English monarch came up with at one point. So the royal we doesn't really hold sway with the scripture. The second option, that it's based on Elohim refers not just to God, but Elohim refers to the divine beings. And the word itself, El is a word, and Elohim in the plural is very, very flexible. It refers to beings of the divine realm or divine beings. They don't necessarily have to be God. They could be God, they could be gods, but they could also be other spiritual beings that hang out with God. And this would be something that we might refer to as the divine council. This option is popularized by Dr. Michael Heiser, who's recently died and gone to be with Christ. He's a good brother in Christ, and he spent much of his life working on the idea of the divine council, and goes through Scripture in several places to point out where this is a viable option. The interesting irony is, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he now, because he is with Christ, absolutely knows the answer to the question. So good on him. I hope to meet him in person one day. It will be very much a good time. Option 3. But this is actually an early statement of God's multiplicity. We already mentioned earlier that God is splitting himself in that you have the God who speaks, and then you have the God who is hovering over the waters. You have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. But in this case, he's talking about in the plural now. And so this would be just the continuation of the idea that God is a multiplicity. Now, you wouldn't be able to see here that he's necessarily referring to himself in the Trinity, just more than one. This idea of God referring to himself in the plural, you can see it again in Isaiah 6:8. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? So it's not just Moses' idea, but Isaiah is saying, well, God definitely said that. Again, notice here when he's talking about male and female, you're not seeing a distinction between the two. Male and female both are given dominion over the earth and the creatures. They both are made in the image of God. Now, this actually isn't a pushback per se against Egypt, although it would be against other cultures there, because at least from what I've read, the Egyptians at the time had a fairly solid stance of equality between men and women. All right, 28 to 30. God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. So God's first command to men and women: go forth and make babies. Conquer the planet through your population growth. Subdue it. That means to bring it into bondage, to conquer it, to subjugate it. Giving them dominion. That means to step on it, to rule over it. It's yours to use. Make use of it. These aren't statements that mean cruelty, but they are exploitative. Imagine if you're a monarch and you take a territory that's not previously yours, and now you've captured this, now it's yours to use. And there are all kinds of people who are living there. How would you treat them if you want what's best for what's going to be most productive to you? How would you treat them? Would you just treat them cruelly and subjugate them? It turns out people who are treated cruelly and are subjugated tend to not give you their best. Or would you invest into them in order for them to return that investment back to you? You see, when we are using the earth, it is simply wise for us to take good care of it, because if we don't and we exploit it too far, then that's going to come back to bite us in the future. It's not very useful, for example, to take land and just use it so much you turn it into desert, because then it's not available to you in the future. Instead, you should be wise in how you use your resources. That said, are there morality issues with, for example, strip mining and things like that? No, there are no morality issues involved unless you're talking about, are you properly treating the other people around you in the fact that they also need to use scarce resources. But it's not like we're sinning against the earth. You can't, it's yours to use. Why? Because God gave it to you. All right, 31 and then chapter 2, verse 1. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. Okay, so God sees that everything is very good. Not just good, but very good. Everything is orderly. Everything is in its right place. Everything is going to function as he has desired. The dominions and authorities have been established. Everything's in its place that he can step back from the system and it will flow as it should. And he has even placed a caretaker in his place to run the earth, someone who can be his representative, because that someone has been made in his image. It is, as we say, a well oiled machine. Now, was the world intended to continue forever? This is a question that pops up a lot when you're talking about creationism, because there's this innate idea in us that if Adam and Eve had not sinned, what would the world be like today? Well, everything would be beautiful and perfect. It would all work and nothing would be worn down. But there's no indication in here anywhere that that's the case. God didn't say that what good meant was that it would be that way forever. God said that it was going to achieve its purpose. It was going to do what it was designed to do. Well, what was it designed to do? I guarantee you, your car was not designed to run forever. It's going to take maintenance. You're going to have to work on it. And at some point in time, you'll have to replace it. And there's no reason to think that God did not fully understand that when he made a universe with entropy. Things do, over time, break down. Now, can humans be relied upon, say if they're perfect, to do much of that maintenance for him? Absolutely. But at some point in time, even if it's a quadrillion years down the road, at some point in time, God will have to step in and do something himself to make things continue. There's nothing wrong with that. You haven't defeated God by saying that entropy exists. Verses 2 and 3. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So here you see the completion of God being done with his work, because when God is done with his work, he can take his hands off of the creation and let it go. It's like a clockmaker who finally gets it set up and he dials a thing, I mean, twists the knob until the spring's fully set, and then he sets it down and he takes his hands off and it works. He's done with his creation. It functions. What else do we have here? We have the Sabbath. You see, God rests on this day. Does God need to rest? Is God tired? I mean, man, that was rough. Speaking and making things. Man, that must have been exhausting, right? No, of course not. God is not in need of rest. But you see, by saying that God has rested on the seventh day, he's doing something else. He is instead giving man a right. He is giving man the right to rest himself, perhaps even responsibility to take a Sabbath day. You see, we need rest. The Sabbath was made for us so that we could get the rest that we need. And if God, who needs no rest, rested, then so should we. All right, verse 4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Love the repetition there. All right, this verse actually concludes this part of the story. There are 12 uses of the word toledot in Genesis, and in this particular verse, we're looking at the term the account, or you could refer to the generations or the origin or the offspring. Different versions are going to have a different word to translate the word toledot, and the reason why is because the word itself in Hebrew is translates very loosely into English, and it has been a word of great dispute throughout history, and dispute which, quite honestly, we're not interested in today. In most cases, a phrase with this word would be introducing start of a story or the intro to a genealogy. You'll see that in lot in Genesis, where it's like these are the generations of such and such, and it'll tell you who all of his offspring are. In this case, it actually concludes the story. So Genesis 1 is going to conclude the story. The rest of Genesis, you'll see it introduces the story. And the reason why I think this is the case is because Moses wanted to make a big impact with his initial phrase. And so he could have opened up, this is the account of the this is the account of the generations of the heavens of the earth, and boom, given his account of creation. But there's something so marvelous about starting off with, in the beginning, God did all of this. And then you get that beautiful, mid poetic view all the way through, and then concluding it with, um, a phrase that brings you right back to the beginning again. This phrase about the heavens and the earth, double repeated in order to bring you back to the beginning, which makes it in its own way deeply poetic and, if I dare say so, masterful in literary form. Um, what would be a good way of seeing this? Think back to when you were young and you were first seeing The Lion King, for example, and you get all that introduction, the build up and the build up and the build up, and then you get the title screen. Bam! There's The Lion King. You could think of it this way: He's giving you this big build up through Genesis 1 of all of His creation and how God is unfolding all of this, and then He hits you with that big title. All right. Extra thoughts. So, Dr. John Lennox, who I've pointed out is a fabulous man and a fabulous believer, he pointed out that the verb form used in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It is not the same as in the following verses. That is, it's not the same as the verb tense that's used during the days of creation where he's creating things. And um, and that indicates that these two things, God created the heavens and the earth, and then God created all the details of creation, that um, that they may or may not have taken place at the same time. So he's separating. So the Hebrew itself is separating out the God creating the chaotic world, this chaotic world that he then descends to and he puts order to. He creates that, and at some indeterminate period of time thereafter, he puts order to that. Now, that means that that creation could have taken place, say, 1 second later, or could have taken place 5 billion years later. And there's absolutely nothing that Genesis tells us about that. Moses just hasn't told us which is true. And not only does a text actually technically allow that, but it would have been obvious to the original Hebrew readers that this was the case. And why is that? Because the question of how long the earth was in chaos before it was brought to order was actually addressed by the Egyptian priests. They talked about it, they argued about it. So, I mean, they had their own different ideas, of course, about everything. But when Moses wrote Genesis, he left the question completely unanswered. He left it totally open, either because he didn't know or because it didn't matter. If it mattered to God that we know, then God would have had Moses include it, just tap him on the shoulder and say, don't forget that part. What mattered to Moses, though, relaying the text to the Hebrews, was that they understood not how long it was between chaos and order, but that it was the God Elohim who created both the heavens and the earth in their raw form. And then again, he brought order and detail to creation to give us what we see today. So is Elohim who did both. Is he who did all the things. And this brings up the second point. Atheists often make a category error when they talk about God. They assume that Christians and Jews believe in a God like Zeus or like Thor, a God who does things on earth that we just haven't figured out with science yet. This is the source of the God of the gaps argument that they like to mention. Well, just because, we haven't answered all the questions with science yet doesn't mean that we won't. As science answers things, your God will matter less and less, and eventually he'll just be all gone. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of who God is. And not just who God is, but what God is. Moses in Genesis 1 to 2 addresses this head on. Remember, he's addressing the gods of the Egyptians. And the gods of the Egyptians are the sorts of gods who, once you get answers from science, suddenly they don't matter anymore. After all, Ra, the sun god, once you understand how the sun works, guess what? He doesn't matter anymore. Where do all the flies and the frogs come from? Those gods go away once you understand the reproductive cycle. They just don't matter anymore. Where do plagues come from? Turns out they come from bacteria, not from particular gods. Things like that. Moses introduces to the Hebrews a completely different kind of being altogether. He is nothing like the gods that the Egyptians worship. Those gods are a part of creation. They exist along with the heavens and the earth. They're even younger in most cases than the heavens and the earth. And they're born or they're created. They breathe, they walk, they use objects to make things happen. The God of the Hebrews, Elohim, who revealed himself to Moses, is not created. He is not born. He creates things without tools. It comes from his mouth. And he exists prior to the heavens and prior to the earth, where man dwells, where he dwells. He is before all the things. In many ways, the Egyptian Ogdoad is similar to the God of the Hebrews. According to the priests at Hermopolis, um, the belief that the Ogdoad were infinite beings, unborn gods who created the heavens and the earth, that this is actually the most ancient of all the Egyptian beliefs. Now, if the story asserted by Moses in Genesis 1 is true, then it makes sense that the elements of Egyptian mythology that trace the furthest back in time would be the most similar to Genesis 1, because they would be the most ancient, referring back to what Moses is saying is an even more ancient story. So it would be the least changed from the original story. Read Genesis 1 again in light of the world that Moses is standing in. There are gods everywhere whose whole purpose was to explain how things function from day to day. Compared to the Egyptians, would you say that Moses is behaving in an erratic, superstitious way with regard to the functions of the cosmos? Or is he being a bit more scientific? The sun, it's not from Ra, y'all. God made it to function without any further help. He made the sun as a thing. This was a wild idea at the time. What do you mean that's not a god or the eye of a god? Or what do you? No, it's a thing. God made it to be a thing to do its job. He couldn't describe how it worked, just the fact that it was there and that God made it that way to work. Or how about the sky? Well, it's not. It's not some goddess who's holding up the sky. God made the sky to function in a given way. Now we can look at that and we could say, well, the details, the scientific details about that, we dispute those. Fine, dispute those. But Moses is getting across a point. It's not a goddess. God made the sky to behave a given way. And in this, he's being extraordinarily scientific, is he not? How about how the various animals reproduce? Same deal. They reproduce of their own kinds, just like Moses said they would, because God planned for it to be that way, not because some god or goddess is making it happen. Now, atheists will contend that Moses, or as they would think, whichever guy wrote Genesis, since they say that Moses didn't exist, that he didn't go far enough. After eliminating the rest of the gods, why not just dispatch with Elohim as well? Well, the answer is very simple. Think to yourself, you're Moses. You're standing in front of a burning bush and God is talking to you. Are you going to finally conclude that, well, I guess he doesn't exist either? I mean, that'd be weird. It's really hard to toss God out the window, after he's just had how many miracles he's observed in front of him? God is actively working, and when God actively works, you should be able to see that happen. Moses knew God was real because he kept talking to him. I mean, imagine me pretending that my parents don't exist, or my wife doesn't exist, or my kids don't exist. It would be insane. But even if God had never spoken to Moses, it's still a silly idea. Moses is pointing out a logical creation of the world by a God who has the power to create what the Egyptian gods could never have created. Elohim is a fundamentally different type of being than these gods. The Egyptian gods themselves, they were created. They were products of the natural world. They existed in space and time. Elohim exists outside of these bounds. He is, as the philosophers define him, the essential being. While our universe is bound to time and space and must have a beginning, the essential being must exist outside of time and space and have no beginning. He isn't essential in that some God simply must exist by some preset laws of logic. Rather, he is essential in that if a universe like ours does exist, which does, then there must be a creator of that kind of universe. And that's what makes him essential. We know that God is real because we are here. So Moses is dismantling the foundation of Egyptian religion, bowing to useless, impotent idols of created beings in favor of a God who must, by all logical constraints and reasoning, and by an obvious and persuasive exertion of his own power, must exist and must have created the world. How exactly, with detail, he performed his creation, we'll leave for another day. But we'll let that dispute continue, and eventually, maybe scientists will nail that to the floor, and some of us will feel very good about that. That he did the created must not be in doubt.